part that's the Treasury Secretary, Mnuchin, or whoever's the secretary at a later date, and obviously President Trump, are who's going to manage that. And that's obviously, you can't take the politics out of politics. The Democrats are nervous about the Republicans being in charge of this rather large $425 billion loan program that the Treasury will oversee and administer through lending institutions. So that's something to pay attention to. That's what's being negotiated now. You're hearing a lot about the Green New Deal and other things, and that will be part of this. Again, I'll say it a couple times during this webinar, can't take the politics out of politics, but ultimately this $500 billion fund is what's sticking to. So we can get some of that later, but that's what's holding up some of the negotiations today. There's also some parts in there that deal with I'm going to pull it up here, the Keeping Workers Paid Act. As you know, some of that, that's Division A of the stimulus bill. And so what's interesting for that is it will provide up to $10 million per business, guaranteed loans through the Small Business Administration. Sections 1102 and 1105 of the bill deal with that. What's interesting about that is it's small business, nonprofit, or veterans organizations that have 500 or more members. So think of your large veteran organizations. This is essentially, because of the loan forgiveness, this is the equivalent to a grant. I want to be careful how I say this because the bill hasn't passed yet and it could be amended. But if you spend up for the 8-week period from the origination date of the loan, if you're spending it and you do not reduce your employment, there is loan forgiveness built into the law that will essentially allow you to have that loan forgiven. So especially for nonprofits, this will be huge to keep them afloat. Obviously, nonprofits are going to be getting reductions in their donations and what have you. But also for small businesses, this is going to be a nice lifeline that's going to come to them if and when passed. It can be used to support payroll support, insurance premiums, mortgage, and other debt. So now, who's going to administer? This is going to be through the SBA. So when this passes, and it's hopefully going to pass today, and the president will sign it to law, I would look to the SBA right away to see if there's opportunities there. And keep in mind, it's up to $10 million per business. It will be 100% guaranteed, and this goes through December 31st of this year, 2020. So that's some of the main components of the Keeping Workers Paid division. It's going to be through the SBA. I'm going to move quickly to some of the other topics, and then Therese, I will certainly want to open it up and let folks ask questions, and we can get into some details. A lot of what you guys have heard about is the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, and that's passed already. That was part of the FFCRA. Some of the things that goes into effect, one, it's not effective yet. That's some important to note. It's likely going to be effective by April 2nd, which will be about 15 days after it passes. So there's a couple things. That big high-level picture here, that's the one that allows for paid sick leave and paid leave for employees. The paid sick leave is from the very first day an employee works there, and the paid leave is for employees that have earned that, and we'll get into that. The Department of Labor is going to be putting out the guidelines for this. They're the regulating agency on this, and so a couple things. They're going to put in guidelines on how you do this. There's going to be 30 days, is what the Department of Labor has told folks, of non-enforcement. So if you're a small business and you're trying to get your arms around this, or even a large business that has less than 500 employees, and we'll talk about that eligibility in a second, you'll have a 30-day window to get kind of your house in order, because everyone knows it's going to be difficult it's difficult already to deal with IRS and labor regulations. Now you have a whole new set of rules with paid leave and paid sick leave that you're going to have to get your arms around. So you'll have 30 days if you're running that business. So let's talk a little bit about the eligibility of this. Private employers with fewer than 500 employees. So I bet for most of you who are participating in this webinar, that includes you. But there is an exemption. If you have fewer than 50 employees, I'm going to use the word may, because that's in the statute. I want to be clear, it's not a shall. It's a may qualify for an exemption if the paid leave for school closures or for other issues that qualify would leave your business in jeopardy. This is very vague, but we'll just call it what it is. It was, I think, intentionally done so to give the Department of Labor some leeway in how they do this, and give small businesses some leeway, because they honestly don't have a full appreciation of what they're acknowledging. The spirit behind this is if you have less than 50 employees, you obviously count on every employee a lot more than if you have closer to 200-300 employees. You can work around. And therefore, they want to give these businesses the options that they can work around this if it's going to affect their business dramatically. But it's not a guarantee. So if you have less than 50 employees, do not assume you're exempt from this. If you are not technically, you can qualify for an exemption. So pay attention to that. Again, the Department of Labor has not released any of their guidelines or regulations on this. So it's still early stage, but that's something to keep in mind. Now, the last thing I'll put on that on the eligibility is if you're a private employer with less than 50, while you cannot have a private right of action brought against you by your employee, the Department of Labor can enforce it. So it's interesting if 50 or more, a private right of action can occur if you're not properly administering to the paid leave and paid sick leave. But if you're less than 50, it would come through the Department of Labor. Again, I'm sure everyone's going to try to work through it, but just something to keep on your radar. So how does this work? So a couple things. The coverage for employees is if you're an eligible employee for the emergency FMLA, which most of you are familiar with, and you've been employed for at least 30 days, you qualify for that paid leave. And we can go into the time periods of that. If you're for the emergency paid sick leave, all employees from the first day they start on the job qualify. So let me say it again, all employees qualify. There's something to keep in mind for this paid sick leave. Now, there are 6 levels of how you qualify for that to pay attention with your employees. It's 2 weeks of emergency paid sick leave. And what it is, the standards are, and they go from very specific to a lot broader. That will get tricky, obviously, in the enforcement. First one is obviously a quarantine situation. Or you've been, because you've been diagnosed. Second is if you're actually advised to self-quarantine because you've come in contact with someone. Third is if you're seeking a diagnosis, i.e. a doctor's visit, and you're going to get swabbed. The fourth is if you're caring for an individual under your care that's dealing with this illness. The fifth one is a son or daughter of a school closed or childcare not available. That's a little more broader. And then the sixth one is experiencing similar conditions. So that's obviously a little broader, and that is are you experiencing symptoms and you need to take time off? Nothing's going to be perfect on this, and I think we all acknowledge that when you try to do legislation this quickly. Even when you have time to do it, it's never perfect. But the Department of Labor has some leeway in how they're going to enforce this. So how is it the companies, which we're all now going to be required to participate, how are you going to participate in this? Here's how it works, broadly speaking, and we can get into the details. It's through tax credits. If private employers they'll receive 100% reimbursement for paid leave pursuant to both the emergency FMLA and the emergency paid sick leave act. Health insurance costs are also included in the credit, and then you'll face no payroll tax liability. So, and then this also applies to self-employed individuals, excuse me. So how does that work? So it's tax credits, right? And most of you who run your W-2 and you understand how this works, you understand tax credits. They always say, be careful with this, it's going to be quick and easy to obtain. Well, here's how it's actually going to work. You'll have an immediate dollar for dollar tax offset against your payroll taxes. So as you have your payroll taxes that you come up to pay, if you've paid for time off, you can offset that. And so, for example, if you've paid for the equivalent of $8,000 in paid leave or paid sick leave, and you have $10,000 on your next payroll tax credit that you owe, you actually can reduce $8,000 from that, and then you'll be even. If, say, it was the other way around, you paid $10,000 in paid leave or paid sick leave, and you had only $8,000 due on your payroll tax rolls, you would actually offset the $8,000. You would be eligible for a $2,000 credit from the IRS. They say, and they're going to try to issue those credits and checks as quickly as possible. The idea is through your payroll tax, most of this will be offset unless you just have mass amount of folks taking paid leave or paid sick leave, and therefore you can offset it. But the credits will kick in if that's a situation where you need to have your credits kick in. So that is the part of the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act that has passed, that would provide eligibility to both full-time employees that have 30 days worked with the company, they get the paid leave. And then if you are a brand new employee, you would still get the paid sick leave. But all companies, if you're less than 500, are part of this if you're a private employer. So take note of that. Don't be misled by the 50 and under exemption that say may qualify for an exemption. And it's not clear what those qualifications will be necessarily. It's broadly worded as if it would jeopardize your business. So Therese asked me to look at the difference between the federal loan program and compare that with the state level. So at the state level, I can tell you that, I'm going to pull up my links here to make sure I'm saying it right. At the state level, they have the Florida Disaster Loan. You can find that at floridadisasterloan.org. And that's for a small business emergency loan. How that works is it's something the state has always had. It's part of their catastrophe fund. Without Governor DeSantis put in an emergency order and announced a disaster, this loan immediately kicked in where states can apply. The term of the loan is for 1 year. Applicants are, if you're a for-profit, privately held small business in the state of Florida, that means from 2 to 100 employees, so a little different than the federal definitions of small business. It's up to $50,000 per eligible small business, and loans up to $100,000 may be made in special cases if it's a warranted need. So again, there's some flexibility there. Again, I said the term is only 1 year. And only one loan may be made per eligible business. And all previous bridge loans that you may have received had to have been paid in full. So if for some reason, and this may apply to some panhandle companies, if you already have a bridge loan from the state that you have not fully paid off yet, you would have to pay off that before. They're interest-free for the term of 1 year. That's the reason you would want to do this, obviously. And then the interest rate will be 12% thereafter, after that first year. So it's a obviously very favorable loan, something that a lot of businesses may want to consider taking advantage of. As I talked about at the start, the Keeping Workers Paid Act will also provide a lot of bridge loans that actually could end up becoming a bit of grants, the way the loan forgiveness would work. And I would encourage you to look into those right away as you look through that. I've spoken for 12 minutes. I've gone through quite a bit of what those things are there. It might be best to open this up to questions so that we can see what folks want to discuss and what we can look into. And obviously, if you don't have an answer right away, we can get into that. So I'm gonna pardon my new use of how to use this, but I want to make sure I do this right. So I'm going to unmute everyone. So I'm going to ask you to put your line on if it wasn't already. So when I unmute all, we'll hear a lot of background noise. And then when I unmute all, if you have some question, chime in. And obviously, if someone speaks over someone else, we can sort that out. So I'm going to click the button and see. Okay, so I hear some background noise. I muted it. Does anyone have any questions they want to go over here on the program, on the various packages that are in place or soon to be in place?
Yes. Good morning. I do.
Go for it.
You were talking about having loan forgiveness, part of the SBA loans. Is there a specific link or website, or is this just the general SBA disaster loan application?
Webinar, because I needed a piece of paper to write down what you were telling me.
Yes, actually, it goes through the SBA loan disaster application. So that is, and part of that, the big difference on this is it creates loan forgiveness, which wasn't always there, and the loans are guaranteed up to 100%. So that's a little different than before. They weren't guaranteed up to 100%. So I would go through the SBA's website. Now, to point that out, that bill has not technically passed yet. That is not what's being negotiated. That Division A, it's two divisions of the stimulus package. The Division A part is largely agreed upon between the Democrats and the Republicans. And I can, after this is over, your email address to I4 Business, we can give you a link to the summary of the bill and those links. That's not hard to do. Yes, we go through SBA on that.
Thank you.
Question.
Yes,
Can you hear me? Okay. So for the paid family leave act, it's about not for profits. I mean, that tax credit's not going to benefit them. They don't pay taxes.
Do you mind saying that one more time? There was just a little bit of background noise. I apologize.
So for the paid family leave, what about the nonprofits? You know, that tax credit's not going to benefit them because they don't pay taxes.
Correct. So nonprofits are tricky on this. So For nonprofits, why the keeping employee, and I'm gonna, well, I'll tell you what, while I'm doing the answers, I'll mute all so everyone can hear. For nonprofits, there's two things about that. So you're right, nonprofits, they have a difference on their payroll taxes and what have you. Those part of that part of the stimulus package and the key in the Emergency Paid Leave Act are not going to necessarily benefit. Although I do believe there are some concessions there. Part of that, though, is in the federal in the part that Senator Rubio sponsored, the Keeping Workers Paid Act, is the loans that can go to nonprofits that would be up to 8 weeks as far as how you could administer them, and there is loan forgiveness. It's, you want to be careful how you phrase it, but it's being described to most as a grant for nonprofits because of course they would get the loan forgiveness and no one would have a real issue with that, which will allow them to kind of keep their payroll going and any kind of debt that they have incurred. But I'm going to make a note here to check on that as far as the nonprofits. And if you could maybe in the message board on this WebEx, or if you could send an email to I4 Business, we can track that down later today and get you an answer on that specifically. And perhaps Reese can send that out to everyone when it's appropriate. Before I unmute the line, Joe put into the message board, what if you have already had to lay off hourly workers? That's a great question. What about that is if you read for the Keeping Workers Paid Act, it goes retroactive to March 1. And so if you wanted to re-employ and then take advantage of those loans to keep your employment levels higher, you can. I believe there's no retroactivity in the stimulus package, like generally speaking, but in the paid sick leave as well, some of those tax credits, you can go back in and rehire folks. It's tricky, and I do know in the Division A part that deals with the Keeping Workers Paid Act, they allow you to retroactive to March 1 as long as you rehire and keep those employees on staff. Now, what I said earlier on that with those SBA loans that have loan forgiveness, on all of those, if you reduce your workers, you will get a proportional reduction in the amount of loan that is guaranteed or that you can have forgiven later. So I wanted to point that out to you. So you can go back to March 1. It is retroactive, and then it'll allow you to go forward. I see another question on there before we unmute the line. For the Florida disaster loan, is an owner considered an employee? Now we're getting into a tax question, so I'm going to admit a little bit out of my depth here, and we can certainly get that answer for P. Zeman. But it's as I understand it, if an owner is taking an employee draw, yes. If it's the owner is taking just a traditional owner draw, then no. So it depends on how, and that's a bigger tax question than it is on the disaster loan program. But that would be how you would actually deal with that. All right, I don't see any questions on the board, so I'm gonna open up for other questions that maybe other questions? Yeah, I see a question here about furlough. Hold on, I'm gonna pull it up here. So union, I need to check on the union question. I don't believe, so one question, I'm going to mute everyone's line again. There was a question about if you're union and you furlough employees. As I understand it with how furlough works, as long as you're keeping your employment base up, you would still qualify for these business loans. It wouldn't affect you. But as far as a union, those are typically separate when they're dealt with, and I'm pretty sure unions are considered exempt under FMLA and Paid Sick Leave Act because they have their own way of dealing with this. I can confirm that, but in most cases, unions have always been exempt from these typical regulations because they, in most cases, already have some form of paid leave and paid sick leave, and that is again negotiated in a arm's length transaction between the employees union and the owners. I unmuted the line again. Are there other questions from the group? No other questions. Therese, did you want to have any questions or anything you want me to cover further for the group?
Mention that the federal bill has not been passed, but you have expectations that it will be passed today.
So as I understand it, talking to some of the federal leaders that we stay in contact with, negotiations went through the night between Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin, Majority Leader McConnell, and Minority Leader Schumer, and how they could get to the sticking points. And again, some of this was politics. Some of this was just actual, like, how are these loans going to be administered? But all indications are that today a deal will be agreed upon, and the Senate will pass it, and then they'll obviously give it to the House. The bigger question is the House going to push for their own? Or are they going to exceed? Most folks I've spoken to have suggested that Speaker Pelosi and the House Democrats will accede to the Senate, assuming Schumer, as a minority Schumer in the Senate, has indicated that that's a deal that they're working with. Because obviously the Speaker has been in these negotiations. So
listening.
I hope that answers that. Now I'm going to unmute the line again because there's a couple other questions on the board, and we'll go back to unmuting. So do you have to show, this is a question from Chuck, do you have to show profit and loss statements, or will the 2018 work? Also, is it first come, first serve? I'm going to assume this is for the Small Business Administration loan or for the disaster loan. As I understand it, I believe your tax returns work. If you're talking about qualifying for a stimulus check, that's different. I think they base that off taxes, so your 2018 tax return work, and they base it off that for your income. Chuck, if that doesn't answer your question, go into the message board and let me know. We can get back to that. Here's another question from Rita. Do you have any information on how the workers' compensation is affected by COVID-19? If employees get sick at work, are you to claim it on OSHA log? Also, does it qualify as a paid event plus the paid sick leave? Rita, I don't know the answer to that question. I'll be honest, that's more of a workers' comp question, but if you put your email in there, I have some folks that can get an answer to that question for you before the day is out. But it's my understanding that workers' comp is still treated as workers' comp. In theory, you would not be getting sick from COVID-19 on the job, but in theory you could, and maybe those are a mismatch, and I can get you an answer on that. If you apply for the Florida loan and receive it, does it negatively impact your qualifying for the federal loan when it comes out? No, I do not believe those are considered separate. There will be eventually, as I said at the outset, some of the stimulus package is going to go straight to states and locals. So there'll be some federal drawdown dollars that the state and the locals administer. And there may be some tying those together, but the SBA loan would be different from the state's disaster loan. And I would encourage you, if you need it for your company, to look at both. But I'm confident in saying that those are not considered. Yeah, and Chuck, I see what you said. You're right. It's when they say 2019 tax returns, they're meaning for the one you filed in 2019, which could get confusing because you're right. Your 2019 actual tax returns for a lot of folks haven't been filed yet, and a lot of folks will probably wait till July. 18 income taxes that you paid in 2019 is what they're basing this off of. I'm going to unmute the line again. We don't have any current questions in the chat room. So if you have any questions, feel free to chime in. Well, folks, I'll let Sheree jump in. I want to thank you guys for joining us. If you put those emails in there, we will get you answer those questions. As you can see, the March 4th and March 18th bills have all been passed and are effective. And now we're waiting on Department of Labor to do some guidance for all of us and small businesses, which, as Sharice asked about, is still on. So I want to thank you all today for those questions. We'll get them questioned. And I don't know about y'all, but if you can see me, this is the first time I've worn a dress shirt in about 14 days. So it's pretty exciting, and I appreciate the opportunity to do this with y'all. And stay safe out there. Sharice, anything you want to add in?
I just wanted to say thank you again for your time. Thank everyone for your patience this morning as we put this together, and we will follow up with an email. Any of the relevant information from the call to the entire group. So thank you again. And also, Chris, can you also, once this is, the bill is approved, will there be a link that you can send us information that we can, look at for all of that as well?
Yes, that we can send to you, and I can let you distribute. And then I see, well, one last question, we'll wrap up. Will nonprofits be fully reimbursed under the Keeping Workers Paid Act? Fully is a difficult term because it's difficult to say what the carrying costs are month to month for the nonprofit. But again, up to 10 million per business, including nonprofits, are what you can seek in these SBA loans. Again, nonprofits, it's being expected and projected that they would be getting loan forgiveness on these, which essentially becomes a grant. So how much you qualify for the loan is, and how much you're able to take on the loan for the SBA will be fully reimbursed. And that legislation was that they realized nonprofits would be left behind in this current environment if not taken care of. So the idea is to get nonprofits as close to fully reimbursed as they can during this lull, for lack of better words, in the economy. So I hope that answers the question there for you. And yes, Sharice, we'll get the link out when this is fully passed. Probably more than important than anything, we'll get the link to the bill and to the summary, because this is going to be a rather large bill. The current version of it is way too long for anyone to read on their own. So we'll keep you posted on that.
Okay.
I'm gonna shut this off.
We don't have any other questions. Again, I want to thank everybody.
Okay.
And another question? Well, thank you again. Thank you, Chris, for your time. And we will get an email sent out this afternoon.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.